we are leaving the European Union for no good reason. Leaving because of a flawed referendum in which the majority of the electorate did not give their express agreement to leaving the European Union. A referendum in which many people who were directly affected by the outcome were denied a vote. A referendum in which all of the reasons to leave were based on lies and mistruths. A catalogue of awful lies which demeaned and undermined our democracy. 1 year before the EU referendum, The Independent ran a story to say that support for staying in the European Union was the highest it's ever been. The Evening Standard had run a poll, and it showed that people in Britain wanted to stay in the EU by 3-1. And the Evening Standard at the time said in the editorial, the results indicate the highest support for EU membership for 24 years. If the mood does not change, the referendum would end doubts about Britain's future in the EU for years to come. Leaving the EU was not an issue in Britain. Something clearly went wrong. What was that? For years, our press, particularly the Daily Express and the Daily Mail, were against migrants and against the EU. They had spread a lot of stories, front-page stories, that promoted xenophobia in this country and a hatred of migrants and a hatred of the European Union. So here we are. Migrants cost Britain 17 billion a year. Actually, it's the other way around. EU migrants contribute hugely to our treasury. Daily Mail, migrants spark housing crisis. It isn't true. Yes, we have a lack of affordable housing in Great Britain. Some hospitals are under huge pressure, but that isn't the fault of migrants. If the train is full, do you blame the passengers or the train company for not putting on enough trains? We should not blame and scapegoat migrants, and it's not the fault of the EU if we don't have enough affordable houses. And another one, quit the EU to save our NHS. Absolutely ridiculous. Without EU migrants and other migrants working for our NHS, we wouldn't have one. And then, of course, there was the outrageous Sun front page, Queen backs Brexit. And Buckingham Palace complained to the press regulator and won. This was an untrue headline. And all these newspaper front pages were wrong. If it was just the four of them, it wouldn't be so bad. But we have a daily deluge by our press, the majority of our press, unfortunately, promoting hatred of migrants and misinformation about the EU. So clearly this was having a huge impact. Now combine that with a well-funded Leave campaign who had to rely on lies to win. That doesn't say much for their arguments, but their lies did win. The biggest lie of all, promoted by Boris Johnson, that he took the bus around the country, was that we send the EU £350 million a week and let's fund our NHS instead. Well, we do not send that amount of money every week to the EU because we get a rebate, and that's deducted at source. We never send it. The government can spend it how they want. And what's more, we get a lot of money back. And the other thing is we get something for the money. We buy membership of a club. If you go and join a gym, you're not expecting them to give you loads of money back. You're paying for the service that you get. So that was wrong. And then there was another one. Turkey is joining the EU soon. People started to get scared that 76 million people were about to descend from Turkey to here. It was very similar to Nigel Farage's claim when Bulgaria and Romania joined the EU and were entitled to work here. And he said then 30 million Bulgarians and Romanians will be entitled to come to Britain. I did a big story at the time because the Daily Mail claimed that all the planes and buses from Bulgaria and Romania were full up with Bulgarians and Romanians wanted to come here. I phoned up the planes and buses and we were able to get seats on all of them. It was completely untrue. I complained to the press regulator and 7 months later I won. But the point is that we will never have 30 million Bulgarians and Romanians coming here, and we'll never have 76 million Turkish people coming here, even if Turkey was joining, which they're not in our lifetime, for one simple reason. And that is, we'll never have 30 million job vacancies in this country. And that's the reason people come here, to do jobs that we do not have enough Britons to do. It's as simple as that. And if there are no jobs, then in the main, they either don't come or don't stay. So that was wrong too. And this was something that Boris Johnson also promoted quite heavily during the EU referendum, that Turkey would be joining soon. Well, this lie, and I can call it a lie, even though Boris Johnson is still promoting it, this lie was critical, even though there were many, many lies by the Leave campaign. And now, Dominic Cummings, the campaign director for Vote Leave, said after the referendum, would we have won without that £300 million claim? And he said, all our research and the close result strongly suggests no. This country is changing direction forever based on a lie. We need to take that on board. When, on the 24th of June, we either woke up or we'd been up all night to discover that the country had been literally split in two. The Remain side only got 48% and the Leave side got 52%, wafer thin. This was almost half and half. And one half of the United Kingdom, Scotland and Northern Ireland, voted to stay in the European Union, and England and Wales voted out. But then with cities across England and Wales voting in or out, London very strongly wanted to stay in. This was a disaster for our country, causing huge rifts across the country. Even families are split up, friends are split up as a result of this. It's a tragedy, really. This was totally different to that first referendum in 1975, when the result was a margin of almost 35% for people wanting to stay in the European community. That, we can say, was a truly decisive result. Not this one we've had in 2016, where the margin wasn't barely 4% margin for people who wanted to leave the European Union. That, we can say, was a divisive result. And I don't know yet how we're going to heal from this. This is the problem of referendums. I don't like them. Margaret Thatcher didn't like them. Clement Attlee didn't like them. They called them the device of dictators because we have a parliamentary representative democracy, and frankly, they are incompatible. That's incompatible with referendums, direct democracy. Because what happens now? Who has the higher vote on this? Parliament or the referendum, which was only meant to be advisory? So look at it this way. 46.5 million people were registered to vote in the EU referendum of 2016. 46.5 million people. But only 37% of them voted to leave. A minority. And in those that didn't include people who voted Remain and people who didn't vote. And some people will say, well, you didn't vote, you lost your voice. You don't have a right to complain. But look at it this way. The question of whether Britain should stay in the European Union was extremely complicated. We were not equipped to be able to give an answer. In fact, I was talking to someone here in the audience who said he didn't know. And how can anyone really blame a non-voter when he or she would say in response to the question, should we stay in? I don't know. And in most democracies across the world where they do have a referendum that can change the constitution, they require a majority of voters. And you would never get a change on only 37%. In fact, the irony is that this result would not have been sufficient to change the constitution of UKIP or to change the constitution of the Conservative Party. So you could say, why didn't Parliament set a threshold, as they would have done in other democracies, to say we need a majority of voters to vote for leaving, if that's what you want? Because the status quo, 43 years in the European Union, that is the status quo. Could Parliament have done that? Yes, it could, because it did do that in the 1979 referendum on whether to have a Scottish Assembly. And the result then was exactly the same. 52% said yes, and 48% said no. But yes didn't win. We didn't have a Scottish Assembly in 1979 because Parliament had set a threshold. Parliament had said that there would have to be a threshold of at least 40%. and only around 33% of the electorate voted for yes, so it didn't pass. They didn't set this threshold, unfortunately, for the referendum in 2016, but they could have done. I think they should have done. And in 2016, it was the same result, 52%, 48%, 37% of the registered voters voted for leave, and it got through this time because Parliament hadn't set a minimum threshold. And minimum thresholds are important, but for some reason it wasn't for this referendum. When Theresa May called for a snap general election, she could only get one if there was a 2/3 majority of all MPs in the House of Commons. She would not have had an early general election if only 37% of MPs. So it seems fine for them, but not for the rest of the country. On the morning of the 24th of June 2016, David Cameron, outside number 10 Downing Street, tendered his resignation. He tendered his resignation because he had lost. He had promoted Remain and lost. But on that basis, the entire government should have resigned because the Conservative government promoted Remain. The Conservative government official pamphlet to everyone urged the country to vote for Remain. But he left and left behind the others. And so we had, in effect, a takeover. We had an unelected government of sorts because here we had Theresa May as Prime Minister, unelected. Now, I know we don't elect Prime Ministers directly in this country, but she was going to try and have a new government on an entirely different manifesto than the one the Conservatives had won under David Cameron. And look at this. 70% of her cabinet, including her, had urged the country to stay in the European Union and told us that it was in our best interests and that leaving would damage the country. Just 7 greyed out were leavers. The rest were all strong Remainers. But after the referendum, suddenly they morphed into Brexiters. What happened to principles, I wonder? So there is now two-faced Tories. They weren't in it for principles. What were they in it for? I think power. But look at some of these. For example, before the EU referendum, Theresa May said, "I believe it's clearly in our national interest to remain a member of the European Union." But after the referendum, she said, "Leaving the EU presents us with a world of opportunities, and I'm determined to seize them." Before the referendum, Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary, said, "A strong NHS needs a strong economy. We should not put that at risk with Brexit." But after the referendum, he said, "Brexit can be a great catalyst for change in health and social care." These are the same people, but with different policies now. And before the referendum, Boris Johnson, sporting his President Trump hairstyle, said, "It's surely a boon for the world and for Europe that Britain should be intimately engaged in the EU." He wrote that in a column for The Telegraph when he thought that he would be supporting the Remain campaign, then hovered and decided that it was in his best interests not to. And after the referendum, he said, "We want to engage with the world again in a way that we haven't been able to do for 43 years. This is a myth. Because in the EU, we have the best of both worlds. In the EU, we can trade with our most important customers and suppliers right on our doorstep, where almost 50% of our imports and exports come from and go to, and we can have trade with the rest of the world. It doesn't have to be, and has never been, either or. So this was a myth. And then we had David Davis. Before the referendum, he said, "If a democracy cannot change its mind, it ceases to be a democracy." He said that in 2012 when he was desperate to get another referendum to get us out of the EU. But now we're out, he doesn't want to give us another chance in case we change our mind. Because after the referendum, he said, there must be no attempt to remain in the EU, no attempt to rejoin by the back door, and no second referendum. Clearly, he's pro-democracy. So now we had a new Prime Minister with a different manifesto pulling the strings of Parliament because she wanted to avoid Parliament at all costs. She wanted to pass Brexit by bypassing Parliament. Why? If Brexit's such a wonderful thing, why not allow it to be open to scrutiny? She also wanted to decide what leave meant. Nobody knew what leave meant in the EU referendum. We still don't know. So she's going to decide for us without us having any further say in the matter. But then she was still under the auspices of the 2015 Tory manifesto that got her and her government into power. And in that manifesto, it wasn't for Brexit. There was nothing about Brexit in that manifesto apart from a promise to have a referendum. That manifesto said, our aim is to make Britain the best place to do business in Europe. Of course, you can only do that in the EU. It said, we are clear about what we want from Europe. We say yes to the single market. The manifesto said yes to a family of nations, all part of the European Union. And the manifesto said, we want to expand the single market, breaking down the remaining barriers to trade and ensuring that new sectors are opened up to British firms. So when I say that Theresa May's new government, after the referendum was unelected, they changed the manifesto without a vote. Their manifesto actually was pro-EU, and although it promised to have a referendum, they didn't think they would lose it, and it was pro-EU in that manifesto. Well, thanks to Gina Miller and her colleagues and supporters, she challenged Theresa May's plan to bypass Parliament to get Brexit decided. The High Court and the Supreme Court agreed that this would be illegal. Only Parliament could decide to take us out of the EU. The referendum was advisory only. It wasn't legally binding. Parliament had to be the decider of this, and Theresa May lost. So we had a vote in Parliament. We had a vote to trigger Article 50. But some lawyers are very critical of this because that's not really a debate or a bill or a vote on whether Britain should leave. This was a vote on whether we should give them the notice letter. That's totally different. And then, all of a sudden, Theresa May sought a snap general election for which she needed a 2/3 majority in Parliament. She said she needed a bigger mandate to be able to fulfill her Brexit plans. She thought that she would win a landslide, and she thought that she would increase her majority in the House of Commons. The opposite happened. Big shock. She lost her majority entirely, and she had to do some form of deal with a small Northern Ireland party to be able to continue in power. A very unsatisfactory state of affairs. And you would think any person who is a statesperson, who is pro-democracy, would take this as an opportunity to pause and think, the country's not behind me. The country doesn't actually want the Brexit I've designed because no one knew what Brexit meant, and they don't really want the Brexit that I'm thinking of. But she didn't take that opportunity. She decided that she would carry on regardless, as if the general election hadn't ever happened. Well, now, of course, they don't want us to have a second chance. They don't want us to have any opportunity to reconsider. And Dr. Liam Fox, the Secretary of State for International Trade, said there's about as much chance of us staying in the European Union as of me finding the tooth fairy. Well, Dr. Fox, you should think again. Of course, it's a complete shambles. Britain is not prepared. They're negotiating, but not with the EU. They're negotiating with each other. They don't know in the cabinet what sort of leave they want. They can't agree with each other. And it's quite clear that there's a division here between the EU on the left and David Davis on his team on the right. It's clear that one is prepared and the other is unprepared. And now the government wants to do what the opposition parties call a power grab. They don't want Parliament to be involved in what laws we will retain after Brexit. They're going to put thousands of laws and EU protections into British law, and then they don't want Parliament to have anything more to do with it. They want their own ministers to be able to decide which of those thousands of EU laws and protections we keep, we change, or we scrap. Democracy, rest in peace. Now, what is this all about? I'll tell you what I think this is about. I think this is about a power grab. I don't think that the Brexit campaigners ever thought they would win. And now they've won, they don't want to let go of it because they know that next time, if it was ever put to a vote, they would lose. And it gives me no joy to say that I predicted as much in my article for The Independent before last year's referendum, in which I said, you won't get back your country if you vote for Brexit. you'll give it to the most right-wing UK government in recent history. And here we are. The notice letter that Theresa May sent to the EU, the Article 50 notice, many lawyers now say that was invalid because actually Parliament never made a proper decision for us to leave the EU, so she had no entitlement to send this letter. The government told Parliament that the decision had been made by the referendum, but the referendum was not capable of making such a decision because the referendum was advisory only. So Parliament never had a proper vote or a proper bill or even debate on actually whether Britain should leave. The same question should have been asked to Parliament that we were asked, and it never had that. There are also other legal challenges to Brexit. For example, there were many British people across the EU who were denied a vote, even though in the Tory manifesto they promised that all British citizens living abroad would get a vote. Up till then, it was a 15-year rule. If you'd been living abroad for more than 15 years, you wouldn't have a vote. The Tories promised to scrap it. They didn't fulfill their promise. Many people couldn't vote. And, you know, there were about citizens from 70 different countries living in Britain who could vote in the EU referendum, but most EU citizens living here couldn't. And that's a hangover from our past. These are mostly people with leave to remain in Britain who are part of our Commonwealth and old empire. It was very undemocratic, in my view. I think that actually, when only 37% of registered voters voted for Brexit, it's wrong to say it's the will of the people. It's not the will of the people. And many people living in Britain, when you think 17 million people voted for leave, but that's not a majority in a country with 65 million people living in it. I would say the majority of people living in Britain today do not want Brexit. Many of them didn't vote because they didn't know what to vote for, and many of them couldn't vote, which seems very unfair. The EU referendum campaign was flawed. The country was misled. The antidote to lies is the truth, and the truth normally prevails in the end, but we don't have much time. Britain is due to leave the European Union at the stroke of midnight on the 29th of March, 2019. So our job now is to persuade Britain to do a U-turn on Brexit. That's what we have to do. And if we can do that and Britain changes its mind about Brexit, that will be the democratic process. That will be the new will of the people. Because in a true democracy, voters are allowed to change their minds. Thank you.